Today we're going to begin a new volume in our journey through the book of Hebrews. This is volume 5. It's entitled, You Gotta Have Faith. And as the title suggests, this portion of the book of Hebrews, which spans chapters 11 and 12, these chapters focus on the issue of living by faith. Now, the idea of living by faith is really kind of looked down upon in our society, isn't it? Are you aware of that? Living by faith is looked down upon in our culture. People who base their life decisions on faith are considered by many to be, unintelligent simpletons who, follow fairy tales. You've heard that one or something like that, right? This is what I'd like to suggest to you this morning is everyone lives his or her life by faith. Every single person. It doesn't matter if you're religious. It doesn't matter if you're an atheist. You live your life by faith. Someone once pointed out to me this perfect example of that fact. Every single one of you got here this morning by getting in an automobile, right? Anybody walk here? No? Okay. So every one of you got here this morning by getting in a car, driving down the right side of the road at 55 mile an hour, give or take. Right? Believing that vehicle coming straight at you, that oncoming vehicle, coming straight at you at 55 mile an hour, give or take, is going to hold his or her course and pass safely by you with a good 24 to 36 inches to spare, right? That's faith. That was an act of faith. Why is that faith? Because you did not know as a scientific fact that driver would not cross the line, did you? Did you know that to be a scientific fact? No, in fact, statistics would suggest that a certain percentage of drivers do cross the line. So the scientific facts would suggest that that's an unreasonable decision for you to make, maybe not even an intelligent decision for you to make. But regardless, we all get in cars every day. We pass hundreds of oncoming vehicles, and we base this life or death situation to drive cars on the belief. On the belief. Not on the scientific fact, but on the belief that other drivers are going to stay on their side of the road. We drive by faith, right? And we could tease out any number of other examples. We eat food by faith. We could tease out any number of examples that point to the fact that we all live our lives by faith. It doesn't matter if you're a spiritual person or not, you live your life by faith. You base everyday life decisions on assumptions that you know, assumptions that you cannot prove, and assumptions that you cannot control. And that really is a very practical working definition of faith. We all live by faith. Now, the book of Hebrews gives us really kind of a similar working definition of faith, only the Hebrews definition is biblical faith. And we see faith defined in the opening verses, or the opening verse, I should say, of this morning's text in Hebrews 11:1. Our text is 11:1 through 3. But I'm going to read just 11:1. It says, this is how the book of Hebrews defines biblical faith. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen, and it gives us assurance about things we cannot see. And so biblical faith is confidence and assurance that the hoped for but the unseen will actually happen. Now, if you ask me, that kind of sounds like everyday faith. We hope other drivers will stay on their side of the road. That's the thing that we hope for. It's an unseen reality, but we hope that they will. We're fairly confident that will actually happen. And so this biblical definition of biblical faith sounds a lot like everyday faith. But is biblical faith, is Hebrews 11 faith, is it really that simple? Is it really that simplistic? Is biblical faith simply believing that anything that we could hope for as Christ followers, anything we could hope for, though unseen, will actually happen just by virtue of the fact that we hope for it? So, for example, I hope I win the lottery, and it's an unseen reality because I never play. So, can I just be confidently assured that it's going to happen? But Janis Joplin sincerely hoped that God would give her a Mercedes-Benz. Some of you are old enough to remember that. All right, did she have biblical faith? She hoped for the unseen. All right, can we be confidently assured, just as Christ followers, that anything we hope for is going to happen simply by virtue of the fact that we're hoping for it? Well, those are kind of silly examples, or maybe not for those of you who are playing the lottery. So let's dial in some examples that may be closer to home. We hope for, as Christ followers, we hope for answers to prayer, don't we? Yeah, sure we do. And we hope for answers that, though are unseen, we pray them faithfully. Well, can we be confidently assured that anything, absolutely anything that we would hope for in prayer will actually happen just because we hope for it? Is that Hebrews 11:1 biblical faith? We hope that a loved one will be healed, though that healing is an unseen reality. Can we be confidently assured that that healing will happen simply by virtue of the fact that we're hoping for it? Is that Hebrews 11:1 biblical faith? That's kind of where the rubber hits the road on this whole question of faith for many, if not most of us. And here's the converse, here's the other side, the flip side of that question. If what we hoped for does not happen, if what we hope for doesn't actually happen, what does it mean? Does it mean that we didn't have faith? Does it mean that we didn't have enough faith? Some of us have been told that. Some of us have bought into that is the way that faith works. But is that really what the Bible teaches? Well, this is what we're going to see this morning in Hebrews 11, is that biblical faith is not that simplistic. That's a very reductionistic definition of faith. But at the same time, what I want you to see this morning is that biblical faith is not that complicated. It's not that simplistic, but neither is it complicated. And it's not that simplistic to begin with, because we need to understand that when Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen and the assurance about things we cannot see, it gives us this definition of Christian faith, of biblical faith, in a larger context. The definition is given in a larger context, that Hebrews 11:1 faith is not, or Hebrews 11:1 I should say, is not an isolated, generic, standalone, all-purpose Bible sentence that can be cut and pasted out of the context in which it was written and applied willy-nilly to any situation that we want. I'm hoping for it, I'm just believing it, so it's going to happen. I'm confident of it. All right? That's not Hebrews 11:1 biblical faith. That's wishful thinking. That's at best positive thinking, but it's not Hebrews 11:1 biblical faith. Hebrews 11:1 was written in the context of a train of thought in the mind of the author of Hebrews that begins all the way back in chapter 10. It runs all the way through chapter 11, and it actually continues into chapter 12. And so what I want us to do for kind of the middle portion of our message this morning is follow this paper trail in the mind of the author of Hebrews that defines biblical faith. And so going backwards a little bit, in chapter 10, verse 32, we saw last week these words: "Remember how you remained faithful, even though it meant terrible suffering. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you. Patient endurance is what you need now, so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that He has promised." And so if you remember from last week, the readers of the book of Hebrews remained obedient to doing life God's way. They remained obedient to the will of God through suffering, through persecution and pain. And why did they do that? Because they confidently trusted that there were better rewards. There were eternal promises from God awaiting them. And so there's two key ideas here in the end of chapter 10: obedience and trust. Those are the two key ideas in the mind of the author of Hebrews: obedience and trust. Obedience to God. He said, you're remaining faithful. You are patiently enduring. You are continuing to do God's will. In other words, obedience. They were continuing to do life God's way. And then trust. Trust in God's promises. You knew, readers of Hebrews, that there were better things waiting for you. You knew there were more lasting things that were waiting for you. So do not throw away this confident trust in the better things that God has promised you, these great rewards. And as you continue in obedience, then you'll receive all that he has promised. And so I think you can see here there's two key ideas: obedience and trust. Clearly in the mind of the author of Hebrews. Obedience to God's will that flows out of trust in God's promises. Obedience to God's will that flows out of trust in God's promises. Do you see that? Do you see that? You see that? This is important. All right, so in verse 38 then, as we continue on this paper trail, the author goes on to say, and this is a quote from Habakkuk 2, "My righteous ones will live by faith, but I'll take no pleasure in anyone who turns away." And so the point in the author pulling this quotation from Habakkuk 2 is to underscore what the author has just said in the previous context. My righteous ones. Who are my righteous ones? Those are the ones who do my will. Those are the ones who continue to do life my way, says God. Those are my obedient ones. My righteous ones will live by faith. By faith in what? In the promises of God. So faith is promise believing, God's promise believing obedience. It's the clear line of thought in the mind of the author of Hebrews. And just as an aside, by implication, from this quote in Habakkuk 2, God is pleased with those who do his will because they trust him. He's pleased because they trust him. And this is implied from the Habakkuk quote, because the quote then goes on to say that God is not pleased with those who turn away. That is, God is not pleased with those who say, I'm not going to do life your way, God, because I don't believe that what you have for me is better than what the strokes I'm going to get from doing life my way. And it says God is not pleased with that individual. God is not pleased with those who refuse to obey. God is not pleased with those who refuse to do life his way. If they refuse because they don't trust him. They don't trust that his way is better. They don't trust that his promises are better. They don't trust that his rewards are better. All right, that's an aside. But again, the main point is God is pleased with those who do his will because they do trust his promises. My righteous ones, God said, will live by faith. And so now, as we continue on the paper trail, what is faith? What is faith? 11:1 goes on to say, so faith then is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about the things that we cannot see. And so what is it that is hoped for? What is it that cannot be seen? It's the promises. It's the promises of God. It's God's rewards. That is clearly what the author of Hebrews has in mind, and it's clearly what he's been talking about all the way back halfway through chapter 10. The unseen that is hoped for, that we hang on to, Christ's followers, through persecution in life, through pain in life, through deprivation in life, through suffering in life. What we hang on to are God's promises. God's eternal and better promises. And so what then is Hebrews 11:1? Faith. What is biblical faith? Faith is confidence, it's assurance. In other words, it's trust in what God said he will do. What God promised he will do. Does that make sense? It begins with God's promises. That is what we can be confident will actually happen. And that's not complicated. It's not simplistic, but it's not complicated. Let me contrast that then with popular erroneous theology. Biblical faith is not the simplistic belief that God will make something happen simply because we said it. We proclaimed it. We professed it. And if we then are confidently believing the words we speak, then God has to do it. Faith is not God obeying our commands because we're believing what we said. Faith is us believing God's commands because we believe in what he said. Faith is not God doing life our way because we proclaim something. Faith is us doing life God's way because he proclaimed something. Do you see the difference? It's a huge difference. It's a hugely critical difference because there are people out there who teach this erroneous version of faith that is the exact opposite of biblical faith. There are people we know who have bought into this false definition of biblical faith, and quite frankly, if I can be honest, which I am every now and again from the pulpit, quite frankly, some of you sitting here this morning still might be buying into this false definition of faith, who still subscribe to this idea that faith is me believing something that I said, and God then has to jump on my bandwagon just because I said it and just because I'm whipping up belief in what I proclaimed. But biblical faith is not, I'm going to throw out some buzzwords, biblical faith is not positive confession. Positive confession is not biblical faith. Biblical faith is not name it and claim it. Biblical faith is not blab it and grab it. Biblical faith is not me believing what I say enough. Biblical faith is not me believing enough what I say so that God has to obey the words I spoke, so that God has to do life my way. Biblical faith is me obeying God, me doing life God's way because I trust what God spoke. I trust the promises that God spoke. Biblical faith is promise-believing trust that produces God-pleasing obedience. Not my positive profession belief that produces God's obedience, but belief in God's promises that produces my obedience. Okay? Not simplistic, but not complicated. It begins with God's promise. And just in case you're not convinced that this definition of faith is what the Bible actually teaches, the author of Hebrews then goes on in the whole rest of chapter 11 to give us example after example after example after example after example of individuals who obeyed God because they believed something God said. And what God said came first, and the obedience follows. There is not one single example in Hebrews chapter 11 of somebody who professed something and God did it because they believed it enough. Not one single example of this popular but erroneous definition of faith. The example after example after example after example is God said something and people believed it and they did something. And it happened because God said it. So let's follow the paper trail. In 11:3, the author begins then his hall of faith, his illustrations of biblical faith by beginning with this first example of God speaking and us believing faith. God speaking, us believing, and obeying faith. 11:3 says, by faith we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. Right, so who did the commanding here? Right, this is a long time before any of us were around. God spoke, and the universe came into being, right? So God did the speaking, we do the believing. Biblical faith begins with what something God has said. Things happen in the universe when God speaks a word of command, not when we believe something we're professing, something we're commanding. It begins with God's command. Verse 7, it was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God who warned him about things that had never happened before. And so which came first, Noah building a boat or God saying something? Say it. God saying something. God saying something. God spoke to Noah about things that had never happened before, and Noah built a boat as a result of it. Noah didn't say, hey, God, I'm going to build a boat, and I'm believing you're going to flood the earth. That's completely backwards from biblical faith. Biblical faith is promise-believing obedience promise-believing obedience. I did say it right. Verse 8, it was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as an inheritance. And so what is the order here? Did Abraham positively confess and believe enough in his confession that God was going to give him a land of inheritance, and God subsequently obeyed Abraham's confession because Abraham attained whatever the belief threshold was? No is the answer to that question. God called Abraham to go to a promised inheritance, and Abraham obeyed. God spoke first. Abraham obeyed because he believed what God said first. And so biblical faith is promise-believing trust that produces God-pleasing obedience, not the other way around. Verse 11, it was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. And she believed that God would keep his promise. She believed God would keep his promise. And so did this healing. It's really a healing here. A healing of infertility happened because Sarah proclaimed it and believed it, or because God promised it? Let's hear you say it. God promised it. Biblical faith begins with what God said, with what God promised, not with what we proclaim. Biblical faith is promise-believing trust that produces God-pleasing obedience. All right, there are like a dozen more of these. You want to belabor them? Should we go on? All right, I'm not going to, actually. The whole rest of the chapter is example after example after example after example of individuals who obeyed God. They did life God's way because they believed it's something God said first. They believed something God said, and then they obeyed. Not one single example of somebody who said something that they believed enough was going to happen, and God did it. It's like, oh, okay, you attained the faith threshold. I'm going to make that happen just simply because you professed it. Not one example. Not one example. If you don't trust me, read chapter 11 this week. All right. We're going to spend more time in chapter 11. Sheldon's going to preach on the whole rest of the chapter, 40 verses, next week. I preach on 3 verses. I give him 40. But there's a point that I want you to see, that the author of Hebrews, what I want to do, I guess, is not belabor chapter 11, but I do want to skip up to chapter 12, because I want you to see that the author continues with this exact same train of thought, this exact same definition of biblical faith. He carries it all the way into chapter 12. And this is the idea that he's carrying forward. It's namely that biblical faith is promise-believing trust that produces God-pleasing obedience. And so in 12:1, we read these words, Therefore, after all these examples I've given in chapter 11, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, that is, obedience that results from promise believing, since we have all these witnesses, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. In other words, let's keep doing life God's way. Let's keep obeying God because of the promises that he's given us. And that's what he goes on to say. And how do we do that? We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, who, because of the joy that was awaiting him, he endured the cross. He disregarded its shame. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. In other words, the author of Hebrews is saying to them, he's saying to us, keep on keeping on, church. Keep on doing life God's way. Don't get weary. Don't give up. Don't cave in. We have a whole crowd of witnesses, a whole chapter of men and women who obeyed God because they believed that something that God said, something that God promised, was way better and way more lasting than giving in to sin that so easily trips us up. And let us especially keep on doing life God's way, even if it means pain, and even if it means suffering, and even if it means deprivation, because even Jesus lived a life by faith. He kept on walking in obedience to the Father because he trusted that the Father's promise of joy that was awaiting him was better than and more lasting than the hostility he endured and the shame he endured and ultimately the cross that he endured. And so the point that I hope you can see from this very clear paper trail that begins back in Hebrews 10, it continues through 11 and continues on into chapter 12, is that biblical faith is promise-keeping or promise-believing trust that produces God-pleasing obedience. And so let's read this together. Biblical faith is promise-believing trust that produces God-pleasing obedience. Let's read it one more time. Biblical faith is promise-believing trust that produces God-pleasing obedience. And so what I want to do in just the last portion of this morning's message is then to tease out some practical implications and applications then of true biblical faith. First of all, a point that's implicit in this key idea is that true biblical faith produces obedience. True biblical faith produces obedience. If I really and personally trust that God's promises are better than the best that this world has to offer, and if I really trust that the rewards for doing life God's way are better and more lasting than the best that this world has to offer, then I'm going to do life God's way because I believe it. It's better to do it God's way. And so I'm going to obey. I'm going to choose to do life God's way. As we talked about last week, if I really believe that the rewards for doing life God's way are better and more lasting than caving into the shortcuts of pain relief, or caving into the shortcuts of persecution relief, or caving into the shortcuts of the pleasures of sin, then I'll do life God's way. Because I believe God's way is better. But on the flip side of the coin, if I deliberately and habitually choose not to do life God's way, if I continually say, okay, this is the way God has said to do it, yeah, I'm doing this way, then it might be because I really don't believe that God's promises are better. I don't believe that maybe God's promises are even true, that I don't believe that God's promises are more lasting than whatever strokes I get from disbelief, whatever strokes I'm getting from disobedience, whatever, buzzes and tingles I'm getting from the short-lived pleasures of sin. In other words, if I'm continuing to choose to not do life God's way, it might be because I don't believe. I'm not a person of faith. See that? That might be why I continue to not choose to do life God's way. I am not of the faith. True biblical faith, true trust that doing life God's way is better, that the rewards of doing life God's way is better, it produces obedience to doing life God's way. And so with that implication in mind, I want to quickly just now backtrack to some of last week's material that I left on the cutting room floor. I just couldn't leave it alone and move forward. So we're going to review 2 points, or not review, see just 2 quick points that I didn't talk about. Point number 1, doing life God's way is better than and more lasting than stuff. We saw last week doing life God's way is better than pain, or caving into the shortcuts of pain. We're going to see right now that doing life God's way is better and more lasting than stuff. If we go back to verse 34 of chapter 10, the author of Hebrews writes to his audience, "You suffered when all you owned was taken from you. You accepted it with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you, so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that he has promised." The readers of the book of Hebrews kept on doing life God's way, even after all their stuff had been taken away from them. In fact, we're told that they accepted that with joy. All their stuff was taken from them, and they accepted it with joy. That's just crazy talk, right? How could they be joyful about losing all their stuff and still keep obeying God? Right? We might cave in. We might say, well, I lost all my stuff. God, you don't love me anymore. How was it that the readers of the book of Hebrews got all their stuff taken away and they accept it with joy? It's because they knew that God had promised them better stuff. God had promised them more lasting stuff. And so they're able to say, hey, you want my stuff? Take it. Seriously. It's yours. You can have it all. As a matter of fact, I've got better stuff. You want my better stuff? I'll give you my better stuff. You want to hear about my better stuff? Right? And so they kept on obeying. They kept on doing life God's way because they had faith that God's promises offered them better stuff and more lasting stuff. All right, now let's apply this to today. That biblical truth, that biblical implication and application of faith is completely opposite of what is taught by modern purveyors of so-called faith, who are telling us that if we really believe God, if we really have faith, He'll give us more stuff. Have you heard that one? Prosperity, if you really believe, if you really have faith, prosperity, that is hogwash. That is hogwash. The only prosperity that's true in there is the purveyors of that tripe are prospering on the profits of peddling that tripe because we're buying their books. All right, they're prospering, but it's just plain and simple hogwash. The truly biblical Christian holds stuff with an open hand. It's stuff. It's neither here nor there. We accept it with joy when we have it. We accept it with joy when we don't have it. We accept it with joy when our stuff is taken away. We accept it with joy when we give our stuff away because stuff is neither here nor there. And why? Because we know that God has better stuff. Whatever. God has better stuff, and it's more lasting stuff. So that's one implication I didn't talk about last week. Doing life God's way is better and more lasting than stuff. Last point, very quickly. Doing life God's way is also better and more lasting than the pain of obedience. It's better and more lasting than the pain of obedience. If you recall from last week, the words of Hebrews 10 were written against the backdrop of persecution and pain and suffering for the followers of Christ. And to these individuals who were continuing to obey, who were continuing to do life God's way, in spite of the pain that it was costing them to obey, the author writes these words, picking up in verse 36, so patient endurance. Bad stuff is going down in your life right now. Patient endurance is what you need so that you will continue to do God's will. You'll continue to obey, and then you'll receive all that He has promised. And again, this is another, he dips back into Habakkuk 2. This is a quotation in verse 37, for in just a little while the coming one will come and not delay. And so again, the author of Hebrews is pointing to everything that God has promised, something God spoke, something God commanded, and he's pointing to that as the reason to patiently endure whatever pains we experience as a result of continuing to do life God's way. Whether that be the pain of persecution, or the pain of suffering, or the pain of deprivation. And as I said, he quotes verse 37 to make this simple point, church. It's just a little while. It's just a little while. Hang on though it hurts. Hang on in the pain of obedience to the will of God because it's just a little while. The coming one will come, and he will not delay. You know, some of us are and some of us will be tempted to cave in because of the pain of obedience, because it hurts to keep doing life God's way. The cost of doing life God's way for some of us might seem too costly right now. Or the day may come where the cost of doing life God's way may seem too high to endure. The duration of the tribulation that we have to experience, the duration of persecution that we may have to experience, the duration of deprivation that we do have to experience by choosing what God wants us to choose, by not choosing what God doesn't want us to choose. So the duration of deprivation may seem too long and the pain too big and the payoffs of God's promises too unreal or too unbelievable or too distant or too not worth it to keep on keeping on doing life God's way and paying the prices of obedience. And to us, the author of Hebrews said, it's just a little while, church. It's just a little while. The coming one will come, and he won't delay. So don't give up, church. Don't give in, church. Doing life God's way is way better and way more lasting than just the little while that we experience the pains of obedience. All right, we're going to wrap up there.